Rafferty stood frozen in the marble-floored ballroom, his worn second-hand jacket suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The crystal chandelier above cast dancing shadows across the faces of 200 guests, but all he could see was the expression on Sienna's father's face. Pure, undiluted rage mixed with something worse. Recognition. "You," Harrison Whitmore said, his voice cutting through the string quartet's melody like a blade through silk. His finger trembled as he pointed directly at Rafferty. "You're the reason my company almost went under 3 years ago." The champagne glass slipped from Sienna's mother's hand, shattering against the polished floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Every conversation in the room died. Every eye turned toward them. And Rafferty felt his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble, because the secret he'd been hiding from Sienna, the secret about who he really was about to explode in the worst possible way. But this wasn't how the evening was supposed to go. This wasn't how any of this was supposed to happen. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button, share it with someone who loves dramatic twists, and subscribe so you never miss what happens next. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you all around the world. Let's go back to where it all began. 6 hours earlier. Rafferty had stared at himself in the cracked mirror of his modest apartment, adjusting the collar of the jacket he'd bought from a thrift store for $15. The fabric was slightly worn at the elbows, the color faded from what must have once been a deep navy to something closer to dusty blue. Perfect. It was exactly the kind of jacket a struggling freelance graphic designer would wear to meet his girlfriend's wealthy family for the first time. He caught his reflection's eye and felt the familiar twist of guilt in his stomach. Sienna thought he lived paycheck to paycheck, taking on small design projects to make ends meet. She thought the reason he couldn't afford nice restaurants was because he was barely scraping by. She thought the small studio apartment in the less fashionable part of town was all he could manage. She had no idea that Rafferty Blackwood owned a portfolio of commercial properties worth north of $800 million. She didn't know that his freelance design work was actually him personally overseeing the rebranding of major corporations through his consulting firm. She couldn't have guessed that the modest Honda Civic he drove was parked in a garage that also housed a vintage Aston Martin and a Tesla he never touched. And he intended to keep it that way, at least until he was absolutely certain about her. His phone buzzed. A text from Sienna. "Can't wait for you to meet everyone tonight. Don't be nervous. They're going to love you." Rafferty's chest tightened. Sienna Whitmore was the first woman in 8 years who'd made him feel something real, something that went beyond the superficial attractions of his wealth. When they'd met at a community art class 9 months ago, a class he'd joined specifically to meet people who didn't know his name or his net worth, she'd laughed at his terrible attempt at watercolor painting. Not a polite laugh, but a genuine, snorting, joyful laugh that had made her cover her mouth in embarrassment. "I'm so sorry," she'd said, her green eyes dancing with mirth. "But that tree looks like a very angry broccoli." He'd fallen for her in that moment, for her honesty, for the way she saw a struggling designer instead of a bank account, for how she insisted on splitting dinner bills and bringing him homemade lunches when she thought he couldn't afford to eat out, for the way she loved him without knowing anything about what he owned. His previous relationship had ended in devastation when he discovered that Melanie had only pretended to love him while secretly planning to divorce him and take half his assets. The prenup had saved him financially, but it hadn't saved him from the emotional destruction of realizing everything had been a lie. Every "I love you," every intimate moment, every future they'd planned together, all of it had been a performance for money. After that, Rafferty had made himself a promise. The next woman he fell for would have to love him for who he was, not what he had. So he'd created Rafferty, the struggling designer, living a modest life, and waited to see if real love could find him there. Sienna had found him, and for 9 months she'd proven herself in 1,000 small ways. She'd sat with him through what she thought were financial struggles. She'd celebrated his small victories. She'd never once asked him to buy her expensive gifts or take her to fancy places. When he'd told her he couldn't afford a vacation, she'd suggested they go camping instead, spending 3 days in a state park roasting marshmallows and talking under the stars. But tonight would be the ultimate test. Tonight he'd meet the Whitmores, one of the wealthiest families in Sydney, though they'd recently relocated to their estate in Connecticut. Harrison Whitmore had made his fortune in commercial real estate and property development. Victoria Whitmore came from old money and sat on the boards of several major charities. Their annual Christmas party was legendary, a glittering affair where politicians, business moguls, and celebrities mingled in a mansion that had been featured in Architectural Digest. And Sienna had invited her struggling designer boyfriend to meet them all. Rafferty had wrestled with the decision for weeks. Part of him wanted to come clean before the party, to sit Sienna down and explain everything. But another part, the part that had been wounded so deeply before, needed to know if she'd stand by him even when her wealthy family looked down on what they thought he was. Would she defend him? Would she choose him over their approval? Or would she cave to their pressure and reveal that maybe, deep down, his money had always mattered more than she'd realized? So he'd put on his thrift store jacket, driven his beat-up Civic, and prepared himself for an evening of being judged as not good enough. The Whitmore estate took his breath away, despite himself. The driveway alone was longer than some streets he owned properties on. The mansion loomed against the December sky, every window blazing with golden light, the landscaped grounds dotted with elegant light displays that must have cost more than most people earned in a year. Rafferty parked his Civic between a Bentley and a Mercedes, feeling like an imposter, which he supposed he was, just not in the way anyone would think. Sienna had been waiting at the entrance, looking absolutely stunning in a deep emerald dress that matched her eyes. She'd practically bounced with excitement as she'd grabbed his hand. "You look perfect," she'd whispered, adjusting his jacket collar with tender fingers. "I know this is intimidating, but just be yourself. That's who I fell in love with." The words had pierced his heart. Be yourself. If only she knew how complicated that instruction really was. The party was everything he'd expected. Lavish, elegant, filled with people wearing watches that cost more than cars and discussing their recent trips to Aspen or the Maldives. Rafferty had played his part perfectly, making small talk about the struggles of freelance work, accepting condescending advice from men who'd inherited their wealth, feeling the weight of disapproving glances from women dripping in diamonds. Sienna's mother, Victoria, had been coolly polite, her smile never quite reaching her eyes as she'd looked him over. "How quaint," she'd said, when Sienna had enthusiastically explained Rafferty's work. "I suppose someone has to design those little local business logos." But Sienna had squeezed his hand tighter, her chin lifting slightly in defiance. "Rafferty's incredibly talented, Mom. You should see the website he designed for that non-profit helping homeless veterans. He did it for free because he believed in their mission." That had been true. Rafferty had done that project, though through his consulting firm's pro bono program. Watching Sienna defend him, her voice firm despite her mother's dismissive tone, had made his heart swell. This was what he'd needed to see. This was proof that she loved him for him. Or so he'd thought. Then Harrison Whitmore had arrived at the party, delayed by a business call. Rafferty had been standing with Sienna, her hand in his, when her father had walked through the grand entrance. He'd been surrounded by associates, still talking business, when his eyes had swept across the room and landed on Rafferty. The man had stopped mid-sentence, His face had gone completely white, then rapidly darkened to an alarming shade of red. He'd crossed the ballroom, floor like a man possessed, guests parting before him like the Red Sea. And that's when he'd said it. That's when everything Rafferty had carefully built came crashing down. "You're the reason my company almost went under 3 years ago." Now, standing in the sudden silence of 200 frozen conversations, Rafferty felt Sienna's hand slip from his. He turned to look at her and saw confusion flooding her face, mixing with the first traces of fear. "Dad, what are you talking about?" Sienna's voice shook. "This is Rafferty. He's a graphic designer. There must be some mistake." "Mistake?" Harrison's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Oh, there's been a mistake, all right. Your struggling designer boyfriend is Rafferty Blackwood. The Rafferty Blackwood. He owns Blackwood Holdings, the company that blocked my acquisition deal and cost me $70 million. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Rafferty watched as understanding slowly dawned across Sienna's face, watched as her expression shifted from confusion to shock, to something that looked horribly like betrayal. That can't be." She took a step back from him. "Rafferty, tell him he's wrong. Tell him you're not." But Rafferty couldn't speak. His throat had closed up completely, because Harrison wasn't done. The older man pulled out his phone, fingers flying across the screen, then thrust it toward Sienna. "Here," Harrison said, his voice dripping with venom. "Here's your boyfriend on the cover of Forbes magazine. The billionaire who won't be bought, how Rafferty Blackwood built an empire on principle. That article is from 6 months ago, so unless there are 2 Rafferty Blackwoods with identical faces, your poor struggling designer has been lying to you about everything." Sienna stared at the phone screen. In the photo, Rafferty wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than the entire wardrobe he'd assembled for his fake modest life. He stood in front of one of his luxury properties, looking every inch the wealthy mogul he actually was. When Sienna looked up at him, her eyes were brimming with tears. "Is it true?" Rafferty opened his mouth, but before he could answer, Victoria Whitmore's voice cut through the tension like ice water. "Oh my God, Harrison. If he's Rafferty Blackwood, then he's the one who—" She stopped abruptly, her face going pale. Her hand flew to her mouth. Harrison's expression changed from rage to something far worse. Understanding. Horror. He grabbed his wife's arm. "No, Victoria, please tell me you didn't—" But whatever Victoria had been about to say was interrupted by a commotion at the ballroom entrance. 3 men in dark suits and badges strode into the party with the kind of authority that made everyone instinctively move aside. "FBI," the lead agent announced, holding up his credentials. "We're looking for Harrison Whitmore." The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Harrison's face went from red to ashen white in the space of a heartbeat. "What is this about?" he demanded, but his voice had lost all its earlier strength. "Mr. Whitmore, we have evidence that your recent acquisition attempts have been funded through fraudulent means. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and—" "This is absurd," Harrison shouted, but he was already backing away. "This is some kind of setup. Blackwood, this is you, isn't it? This is revenge for—" The lead FBI agent held up a hand. "Sir, this investigation has been ongoing for 18 months. Mr. Blackwood actually helped us." But Rafferty never heard the rest of the sentence, because at that moment, Sienna's hand connected with his face in a slap that echoed through the entire ballroom. "You knew," she breathed, tears streaming down her face now. "All this time, you knew what my father was doing, and you've been investigating him while pretending to love me. Was I just part of your investigation? Was everything between us just another business move?" "Sienna, no, Rafferty reached for her, but she jerked away from him like his touch burned. "Don't," she said, her voice breaking. Don't touch me. Don't talk to me. I can't even look at you right now." She turned and ran from the ballroom, her emerald dress disappearing into the crowd of shocked guests. Rafferty started after her, but one of the FBI agents stepped into his path. "Mr. Blackwood, we're going to need you to stay. There are some questions about—" A woman's scream cut through the chaos. It came from upstairs, high and terrified, and absolutely primal. It was Sienna's voice. Rafferty's blood turned to ice. He shoved past the FBI agent and sprinted toward the grand staircase, taking the marble steps 3 at a time. Other guests were already moving, drawn by the sound of terror. He followed Sienna's continued screaming to a bedroom at the end of the upstairs hallway. The door was open. Sienna stood in the center of the room, her hands pressed to her mouth, her entire body shaking. She was staring at something on the floor behind the bed. Rafferty pushed into the room and immediately wished he hadn't. Wished he could unsee what Sienna had found. Wished he could protect her from this, from everything that was happening. But it was too late. Because lying on the floor, her expensive jewelry scattered around her like broken stars, was a woman Rafferty recognized from photos in the Whitmore family albums. Sienna's older sister, Adelaide, who had supposedly moved to London 3 years ago and hadn't been heard from since. Adelaide Whitmore was very clearly dead, and from the looks of the scene, the undisturbed dust, the state of the body, the old bloodstains on the carpet that someone had tried to cover with a throw rug, she had been dead for a very, very long time. Which meant that everything everyone thought they knew about the Whitmore family, about this party, about this entire night, was built on secrets so dark that Rafferty's deception suddenly seemed like nothing at all. And in that moment, as Sienna's screams continued and footsteps thundered up the stairs behind them, Rafferty realized with crushing certainty that nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this. The chaos that erupted in the Whitmore mansion after Sienna's discovery of her sister's body was like nothing Rafferty had ever witnessed. Within minutes, the glittering Christmas party transformed into a crime scene. Police cars flooded the circular driveway, their red and blue lights painting the mansion's white columns in alternating colors of emergency. Guests who had come for champagne and networking were now being herded into the ballroom and questioned as potential witnesses. But all Rafferty could focus on was Sienna. She sat on a velvet chair in one of the side parlors, wrapped in a blanket despite the room's warmth, staring at nothing. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, but now she seemed beyond tears, trapped in some horrible place between shock and grief. A female detective sat beside her, speaking in low, gentle tones, but Sienna didn't appear to hear anything at all. Rafferty stood in the doorway, kept at a distance by a uniformed officer who had strict instructions not to let him approach. He'd tried 3 times already. Each time, Sienna had looked at him with such raw pain and hatred that it had physically hurt, like someone driving nails into his chest. "Mr. Blackwood?" The FBI agent from earlier, his badge identified him as Special Agent Drummond, appeared at Rafferty's elbow. "We need to talk. Now." Rafferty reluctantly tore his eyes away from Sienna and followed Drummond to Harrison Whitmore's study, a room filled with leather-bound books and expensive art that now felt more like a museum of lies. 2 other agents waited inside, along with a detective from the local police department. "Sit," Drummond said, gesturing to a chair. It wasn't a request. Rafferty sat. "I didn't know about Adelaide," he said immediately. "I swear to God I had no idea." "We know," Drummond interrupted. "Our investigation focused on Harrison's business dealings, not his family. But this—" He ran a hand through his graying hair. "This changes everything. We need to know exactly what you told us about the Whitmores and when." For the next hour, Rafferty explained everything. How 3 years ago, He'd blocked Harrison Whitmore's attempt to acquire a struggling property development company that Rafferty had been quietly supporting. How he'd discovered that Harrison's financing for the acquisition came from sources that didn't quite add up. Shell companies, offshore accounts, investment groups that existed only on paper. How he'd reported his suspicions to the FBI, triggering the investigation that had led to tonight's arrest. "But I never investigated his family," Rafferty insisted. "I never looked into his personal life beyond basic due diligence. The financial crimes were enough. I had no reason to dig deeper." "And your relationship with his daughter?" Detective Chen, Rafferty caught himself. The name on her badge was Detective Morrison, asked, her pen poised over her notepad. "That started 9 months ago, you said? 4 months after you reported Harrison Whitmore to us?" Rafferty felt his stomach drop. He saw immediately where this was going. "It wasn't like that. I met Sienna by complete chance at an art class. I didn't even know who her father was until our 3rd date when she mentioned his name. By then I was already falling for her." "But you didn't tell her who you were," Morrison pressed. "You pretended to be poor. Why?" "Because," Rafferty's voice cracked. He took a breath and tried again. "Because I needed to know if someone could love me, not for my money, not for what I could give them, just me." The agents exchanged glances. Drummond leaned back in his chair, studying Rafferty with sharp eyes. "That's either the most romantic thing I've ever heard or the most calculated manipulation. I can't decide which." "It's the truth," Rafferty said quietly. "And now the woman I love thinks I used her to get to her father. She thinks everything between us was a lie. And I don't know how to make her understand that she was the only real thing in any of this." Before anyone could respond, there was a sharp knock on the door. A young officer stuck his head in. "Sir, Mrs. Whitmore is asking to speak with Mr. Blackwood. She says it's urgent. She says she'll only talk if he's present." The room fell silent. Drummond and Morrison looked at each other, having some kind of wordless conversation. Finally, Drummond nodded. "All right, but we're recording everything, and we'll be right there with you. Let's see what Victoria Whitmore has to say." They found Victoria in the mansion's conservatory, surrounded by plants that probably cost more than most people's cars. She'd aged a decade in the past 2 hours. Her perfect makeup was streaked with tears. Her carefully styled hair had come partially undone, and her hands shook as she gripped a glass of water she wasn't drinking. When Rafferty entered with the agents, Victoria looked up at him with eyes full of desperation and something else. Guilt so profound it seemed to radiate from her like heat. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice hoarse. "About Adelaide, about what really happened." Morrison started the recording device. "Mrs. Whitmore, you should know that anything you say can be used." "I don't care," Victoria interrupted. I can't live with this anymore. Not after everything that's happened tonight. Not after seeing my baby girl find her sister like that." She looked directly at Rafferty. "You need to know the truth, for Sienna's sake." Rafferty sat down slowly, his heart hammering. "What happened to Adelaide?" Victoria's face crumpled. "It was an accident. 3 years ago, Adelaide found out about her father's business, dealings. She'd always been the smart one, the curious one. She worked in his office that summer before she was supposed to start her master's program in London. She found documents, transfers, accounts, evidence of everything Harrison was doing." "She confronted him?" Drummond asked. "Worse." Victoria's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "She threatened to go to the authorities. She said she couldn't let her father hurt people, even if it meant destroying our family. They argued in this very house, right here during our annual Christmas party 3 years ago. Harrison had been drinking. Adelaide was so angry, so righteous. She said she was going to the FBI the next morning." Rafferty felt ice spreading through his veins. "Victoria, what did Harrison do?" "He didn't mean to hurt her," Victoria said, but the words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. They were arguing on the upstairs landing. He grabbed her arm to stop her from leaving. She pulled away. She was at the top of the stairs and she fell. She hit her head on the marble floor at the bottom. The room was completely silent, except for the quiet hum of the recording device. She was still breathing when Harrison reached her, Victoria continued, tears streaming down her face now. We called 911, we did. But Harrison, he panicked. He thought about everything Adelaide was going to expose. He thought about prison, about losing everything. And when the paramedics arrived, he told them Adelaide had been drinking, that she'd fallen by accident. He made me confirm his story. But she died, Morrison said, her voice carefully neutral. Victoria nodded. At the hospital, they said the head trauma was too severe. We could have told the truth then. We should have. But Harrison had already set so many lies in motion. He bribed the hospital staff to keep it quiet. He bribed the police who responded. He created fake travel documents showing Adelaide had moved to London. He sent emails from her accounts. He kept the lie going because he was terrified of what would happen if anyone learned the truth. And you helped him, Rafferty said, unable to keep the disgust from his voice. I was weak, Victoria whispered. I chose my husband over my daughter. I chose protecting our name over justice. I let him bring Adelaide's body back to this house and hide her away like she was something shameful, instead of our beautiful girl who just wanted to do the right thing. Drummond leaned forward. Why didn't you move the body? Why keep her here where someone might find her? Harrison couldn't let her go, Victoria said. I know how insane that sounds, but he visited that room every day. He talked to her. He apologized. It was like he couldn't fully accept what he'd done unless he could see her. And I was too much of a coward to stop him, or to do the right thing myself. Rafferty thought about Sienna, about how for 3 years she'd believed her sister was living in London, sending occasional emails, just too busy to visit. He thought about how she'd sometimes mention missing Adelaide, wondering why her sister had become so distant. And all along, Adelaide had been dead in a bedroom just down the hall from where Sienna had grown up. Sienna doesn't know any of this? He asked. Victoria shook her head. She was away at college when it happened. She was studying in California. We told her Adelaide had left early for London, that they'd said their goodbyes before she returned. Sienna always felt guilty that she hadn't been here for Adelaide's going-away party, a party that never actually happened. My God, Morrison breathed. The psychological damage. I need to tell her, Victoria said suddenly, standing up on shaky legs. I need to tell Sienna the truth before she hears it from someone else. She deserves to hear it from me. Mrs. Whitmore, you'll need to give a full formal statement first, Drummond said, but his voice was gentler now. And we'll need to verify everything you've told us. But yes, someone should tell Sienna. And maybe... He looked at Rafferty. Maybe it should be someone she can trust. She doesn't trust me, Rafferty said bitterly. She thinks I'm just another person who lied to her. Then you'd better figure out how to fix that, Drummond said. Because that girl just lost her sister for the second time, found out her father is a criminal and possibly a murderer, and discovered that her mother has been lying to her for years. She's going to need someone real in all of this, someone who actually loves her. Are you that person? Or were you just playing a part? The question hit Rafferty like a physical blow, because it was the same question he'd been asking himself for 9 months. Had he really loved Sienna? Or had he just loved the idea of someone loving him without his money? Had his deception been about protecting his heart? Or had it been about control? About testing her like she was some kind of experiment? He thought about the way Sienna laughed at his terrible jokes. The way she'd held his hand during a movie that scared her. The way she'd looked at him this morning, adjusting his collar, telling him to just be himself. The way she'd defended him to her mother even when she thought he was nobody important. She'd passed his test. She'd proven her love was real. But had he proven his? "I love her," Rafferty said, and for the first time in hours, he felt absolutely certain of something. "I love her more than anything, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving it to her if she'll let me." "Then go," Morrison said. "We'll finish with Mrs. Whitmore. You go find that girl and tell her the truth. All of it. No more secrets. No more tests. Just the truth." Rafferty stood, his legs unsteady, and headed towards the door. But before he could leave, Victoria called out to him. "Mr. Blackwood?" She looked smaller now, older, broken. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but please, when you tell Sienna everything, tell her that her sister loved her. Tell her that the last thing Adelaide said before she fell was that she was doing this for Sienna's future, so her little sister wouldn't grow up benefiting from dirty money. Tell her that Adelaide died trying to do the right thing." Rafferty nodded, not trusting his voice, and left the conservatory. He found Sienna exactly where he'd left her, still wrapped in that blanket, still staring at nothing. The detective who'd been with her had stepped away to give her space. Rafferty approached slowly, like she was a wounded animal that might bolt. "Sienna?" She didn't look at him. "Go away, Rafferty, or Blackwood, or whoever you actually are. Just go away." "I need to tell you something," he said softly. "About Adelaide, about your father, about all of it, and I need you to hear me out. After that, if you never want to see me again, I'll respect that. But right now, you need to know the truth." Something in his voice must have reached her because she finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were hollow with grief and betrayal, but there was also a flicker of something else. Curiosity, maybe, or just desperate need for answers in a night that had destroyed her entire world. "5 minutes," she said. "You get 5 minutes. Then I want you gone forever." Rafferty sat down across from her, his heart breaking at the distance she'd put between them. Emotional distance that felt like miles, even though they were barely 3 feet apart. He took a deep breath and prepared to tell her everything. But before he could speak, the door burst open and a young officer ran in, his face pale with shock. "Detective Morrison," he called out. "You need to come quick. We found something else in that bedroom upstairs, behind the wall. There are documents, files, evidence of—" He stopped, looking at Sienna, clearly uncertain about speaking in front of her. "Just say it," Morrison commanded, striding into the room. The officer swallowed hard. "There's evidence of at least 4 other victims. It looks like Harrison Whitmore has been killing people for years." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Rafferty heard Sienna gasp, saw her stand up on trembling legs, the blanket falling away. "No," Sienna whispered. No, not just an accident. Please tell me Adelaide was just an accident." But the look on the officer's face told them all they needed to know. Adelaide might have been the first, but she hadn't been the last. And suddenly, the FBI investigation into financial crimes seemed almost quaint compared to the monster that Harrison Whitmore had actually been. And somewhere in the house, probably in a holding cell waiting to be transferred, Harrison Whitmore sat knowing that his world had finally collapsed. But what he didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was that his darkest secret was still hidden. Because at that very moment, in a private psychiatric facility 400 miles away, someone else was watching the news. Coverage of the arrests at the Whitmore estate. Someone who had been declared dead in a car accident 7 years ago. Someone who had been Harrison's business partner before mysteriously disappearing. Someone who was very much alive and very, very angry. And that person was about to make their move. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of horror and revelation that seemed to have no bottom. Each time Rafferty thought they'd uncovered the full extent of Harrison Whitmore's crimes, another layer of darkness revealed itself beneath. The documents hidden behind the wall in Adelaide's room told a story that made national headlines. Harrison hadn't just been a white-collar criminal cooking the books. He'd been systematically eliminating anyone who threatened to expose him. A former business partner who'd discovered the fraud, an accountant who'd asked too many questions, a journalist who'd been investigating his deals, a rival developer who'd refused to be bought out, and Adelaide, his own daughter, who'd loved justice more than she'd feared her father. 4 bodies recovered from various properties Harrison owned. 4 families who'd spent years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. 4 people who'd died because they'd stood in Harrison Whitmore's way. Sienna had collapsed completely after that first night. Not physically, though God knows the strain was visible in her hollow cheeks and trembling hands, but emotionally. She'd retreated somewhere deep inside herself, a place where the truth couldn't quite reach her. Rafferty had watched helplessly as she'd moved through the motions of identifying her sister's body, answering police questions, and sitting through her mother's arrest as an accessory to Adelaide's death. Victoria had been charged with obstruction of justice and being an accessory after the fact. She'd cooperated fully with investigators, leading them to evidence that helped build the case against Harrison. But cooperation couldn't erase 3 years of lies, couldn't bring back a daughter she'd helped hide. Rafferty had tried to stay close to Sienna through all of it, but she'd built walls around herself that seemed impossible to breach. She'd moved into a hotel, refusing to return to either her apartment or her parents' estate. She'd stopped answering his calls after the second day. When he'd tried to visit, hotel security had turned him away at her request. He'd sent her a letter, an actual handwritten letter, explaining everything, about his past relationship and the betrayal that had nearly destroyed him, about his decision to live as someone ordinary to find real love, about meeting her and falling for her instantly before he'd known who her father was, about how learning her last name had thrown him into turmoil, but by then he'd been too deep in love to walk away, about how he'd never used her to investigate Harrison. The investigation had started months before they'd even met. He'd explained that he'd kept his identity secret not to test her like some psychological experiment, but because he was terrified. Terrified that if she knew about his wealth, everything would change. Terrified that another person he loved would see dollar signs instead of him. Terrified of being hurt again in a way he wasn't sure he could survive. He'd poured his heart onto those pages, confessing that his deception had been wrong even if his feelings had been real. That he should have trusted her enough to be honest. That he'd been a coward hiding behind a fake identity instead of being brave enough to be vulnerable as himself. He'd ended the letter with a simple truth. I love you, Sienna Whitmore, not the daughter of wealth, not someone connected to my investigation, just you. The woman who laughs at terrible watercolor paintings and makes sandwiches cut into triangles because she read somewhere that they taste better that way. The woman who cries at animal shelter commercials and argues passionately about whether books are better than their movie adaptations. You. And I will love you for the rest of my life, whether you choose to forgive me or not. He'd hand-delivered the letter to the hotel's front desk, praying she'd read it. But 3 days had passed with no response, and Rafferty had begun to accept that he might have lost her forever. Then, on the 4th morning after that terrible Christmas party, everything changed again. Rafferty was in his real apartment, not the modest studio he'd maintained for Sienna's benefit, but his actual penthouse overlooking the harbor, when his phone rang. An unknown number. He almost didn't answer, exhausted from sleepless nights and the weight of everything that had happened. But something made him pick up. Is this Rafferty Blackwood? A woman's voice, unfamiliar, with an edge to it that made his instincts prickle with warning. Who is this? My name is Margot Ashford. I believe you've heard about what Harrison Whitmore did. What you haven't heard is that 27 years ago, I was his first victim. Or at least I was supposed to be. Rafferty's blood ran cold. What are you talking about? I was Harrison's business partner when we were both starting out. I discovered he was embezzling from our clients. When I confronted him, he tried to kill me, staged a car accident that should have ended with me dead. Instead, I ended up in a coma for 3 months. When I woke up, Harrison had spread rumors that I'd been mentally unstable, that I'd tried to commit suicide. He had me declared incompetent and committed to a private facility where he could control the narrative. My God, Rafferty breathed. How did you survive? Escape? I didn't escape. I've been in that facility for 27 years, Mr. Blackwood, watching the news, reading about Harrison's success, knowing he'd gotten away with trying to murder me. The staff believed his story. My family believed it. Everyone believed that Margot Ashford had lost her mind, until 3 days ago, when I saw the news about his arrest. Rafferty's mind raced. You need to come forward. Your testimony could— I am coming forward, Margot interrupted. I've already contacted the FBI, but that's not why I'm calling you. I'm calling because I know where Harrison kept his insurance policy, evidence he compiled on everyone he ever did business with, everyone who ever posed a threat. He kept it in case he needed leverage. And Mr. Blackwood, there's information in there about you. What kind of information? The kind that proves you had nothing to do with investigating Harrison before you reported him 3 years ago. The kind that proves your relationship with his daughter was completely separate from any investigation. The kind that proves you were telling the truth about everything. Rafferty's heart leaped. Where is this evidence? I'll give it to the FBI on one condition. You bring Sienna Whitmore to meet me. I need to see her. I need to tell her something about her sister. What about Adelaide? There was a long pause. When Margot spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. Adelaide knew about me. She found my file 2 weeks before she died. She came to visit me at the facility. She was the only person in 27 years who believed me, who saw through Harrison's lies. She promised me she was going to expose everything, not just the financial crimes, but what he'd done to me. That's why Harrison killed her. Not because she found out about the money, but because she was going to prove he'd tried to murder me and covered it up for decades. Rafferty felt tears burning in his eyes. Adelaide was trying to save you. She was trying to save everyone, Margot said softly. And now I need to save her sister. Because from what I've seen on the news, Sienna Whitmore is drowning. And the one person who might be able to pull her out is too afraid to reach for her hand. So here's what's going to happen, Mr. Blackwood. You're going to convince Sienna to come with you to see me. You're going to let me tell her the truth about her sister's courage, and you're going to stop hiding behind your fear and fight for the woman you love. She won't see me, Rafferty said, his voice breaking. I've tried. She won't even read my messages. Then try harder, Margot said sharply. Adelaide died fighting for what was right. The least you can do is fight for the person you claim to love. Or are you going to let fear win again? The words struck Rafferty like a slap. She was right. He'd been respecting Sienna's wishes, giving her space. But maybe what she needed wasn't space. Maybe what she needed was someone who would refuse to give up on her. Someone who would break through the walls she'd built and remind her that not everyone in her life had been lying. Where are you? Rafferty asked. Margot gave him an address, the psychiatric facility 4 hours north. I'll expect you and Sienna by evening. Don't disappoint me, Mr. Blackwood. And don't disappoint Adelaide's memory. The line went dead. Rafferty stared at his phone for exactly 10 seconds. Then he grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. No more waiting. No more giving Sienna space to push him away. If she wanted him gone from her life forever, she could tell him to his face. But first, she was going to hear what Margot had to say about Adelaide. The hotel staff tried to stop him, but Rafferty was done playing by rules that kept him away from the woman he loved. He bypassed the front desk entirely, slipping into the elevator behind a room service cart and riding up to Sienna's floor. When he knocked on her door, she didn't answer. When he knocked harder and called her name, She told him to go away. So he sat down in the hallway outside her room and started talking through the door. "I'm not leaving," he said. "You can call security and they can drag me out of here. But I'll just come back. Because I got a call from someone who has information about Adelaide, and you need to hear it. Her name is Margot Ashford, and your sister was trying to save her life when Harrison killed her." Silence from the other side of the door. Rafferty kept talking. He told Sienna everything Margot had said, about being Harrison's first victim, about Adelaide discovering the truth, about the evidence that proved Rafferty had never used Sienna as part of any investigation. "I know you're angry with me," he said softly. "I know I hurt you by lying about who I was. I know I broke your trust, and I don't know if I can ever fully repair that. But Sienna, your sister died fighting for justice. She died trying to expose your father and save an innocent woman who'd been locked away for nearly 3 decades. And Margot wants to meet you. She wants to tell you about Adelaide's courage. She wants you to know that your sister was a hero." More silence. Then, so quietly, he almost missed it. "Why should I believe anything anymore? Everyone's been lying to me. My father, my mother, you. How do I know this isn't just another manipulation?" "You don't," Rafferty admitted. "You have no reason to trust me, but you have every reason to hear what Margot has to say about Adelaide. Come with me to meet her. If after that you never want to see me again, I'll accept it. But don't let your anger at me stop you from learning the truth about your sister." The door opened. Sienna stood there, and Rafferty's heart broke at the sight of her. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore sweatpants and an old college t-shirt, so different from the elegant woman who'd worn emerald silk to that party. But she was still the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. 4 hours there, 4 hours back," Sienna said flatly. "Then you leave me alone, forever. Do you understand?" "I understand," Rafferty said, even though the words felt like swallowing glass. The drive north was silent for the first hour. Sienna sat as far from Rafferty as the car's interior would allow, staring out the window at the passing landscape. Rafferty didn't try to force conversation. He just drove, his hands steady on the wheel even though his heart was hammering. Finally, somewhere around the second hour, Sienna spoke. "Did you ever really love me? Or was I just convenient?" Rafferty's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I loved you from the moment you laughed at my painting of an angry broccoli. I loved you when you insisted on splitting the check even though I could see you counting your money afterward to make sure you had enough for rent. I loved you when you fell asleep during a movie and drooled on my shoulder. I loved you every single day we were together, and I love you right now, even though you can barely stand to look at me." "But you lied to me," she said, and her voice cracked. "About everything. Who you were, what you could afford, your entire life. How am I supposed to believe any of the feelings were real when the person having them wasn't?" "I was real," Rafferty insisted. "The money, the properties, the business empire, those are just things I own. They're not who I am. The man who took you camping and burned the marshmallows, that was me. The man who listened to you talk about your dreams for hours and never got bored, that was me. The man who fell asleep holding you because it was the only time he felt at peace, that was me, Sienna. The real me." Tears streamed down her face now. "Then why hide it? If you really loved me, why not just tell me the truth?" "Because I was terrified," Rafferty said, his own voice rough with emotion. "Because I'd been hurt before by someone who pretended to love me for who I was, when all she wanted was what I had. Because I needed to know." He stopped, realizing how selfish it sounded. "Needed to know what?" Sienna demanded. "Needed to test me? Needed to make sure I passed some kind of examination before you could trust me with the truth?" "Yes," Rafferty admitted, the word tearing out of him. And I know how wrong that was. I know I should have trusted you. I know I should have been honest from the beginning. But I was broken, Sienna. I was so broken from before that I couldn't see straight. And when I met you, you were this perfect, genuine person who saw good in everyone, who loved people for who they were, and I was terrified that if you knew about my money, you'd change. Not because you were fake, but because money changes everything. It changes how people see you, how they treat you, what they want from you. So you took away my choice, Sienna said quietly. You decided I couldn't handle the truth. You decided you knew better than I did how I would react. The words hit Rafferty like a punch to the gut, because she was absolutely right. Yes, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have given you the chance to prove yourself on even ground. I should have trusted that. Your love was strong enough to survive the truth. I failed you, and I failed us, and I will regret that for the rest of my life. Sienna was quiet for a long moment. Then, my entire life has been built on lies. My father's success was built on fraud and murder. My mother's perfect marriage was built on covering up my sister's death. And what I thought was real love was built on deception. How am I supposed to believe in anything anymore? I don't know, Rafferty said honestly. I don't have an answer for that. All I can tell you is that my love for you was never a lie. The way I felt when you smiled at me, when you held my hand, when you defended me to your mother, that was all real. The life I was living might have been fake, but my feelings never were. They drove in silence for another hour. When they finally arrived at the psychiatric facility, a sprawling complex that looked more like a resort than a hospital, Sienna turned to him. After we hear what Margot has to say, I need time, she said. Real time, to figure out who I am without my family's lies, to grieve for Adelaide properly, to decide if I can ever trust anyone again, including you. I'll give you all the time you need, Rafferty promised. Even if it takes forever, even if your answer is no, you're worth waiting for. Margot Ashford was nothing like Rafferty had expected. Instead of looking like someone who'd spent 27 years in a psychiatric facility, she looked vibrant and sharp, her silver hair cut short, her eyes bright with intelligence. She greeted them in a private meeting room with the facility administrator present. Sienna Whitmore, Margot said, her voice gentle. You look just like your sister. Sienna's composure cracked immediately. You knew Adelaide? Only for a short time, but she made an impression I'll never forget, Margot said. She gestured to chairs, and they all sat down. What Margot told them over the next hour painted a picture of Adelaide that Sienna had never fully known. A courageous young woman who'd been willing to sacrifice everything to expose the truth. Margot explained how Adelaide had found her file in Harrison's home office, how she'd traced the records to the facility, how she'd visited Margot and listened to her story with an open heart. Your sister believed me when no one else would, Margot said, tears in her eyes. She told me she was going to get me out. She was going to expose your father and free me from this place. She said she couldn't let her family's wealth be built on other people's suffering. She died trying to save you, Sienna whispered. She died being the best of what humanity can be, Margot corrected gently. Brave, principled, willing to sacrifice her own comfort for what was right. Your father tried to bury her memory along with her body, but I'm here to tell you that Adelaide Whitmore was a hero, and you should be proud to be her sister. Sienna broke down then, sobbing so hard her whole body shook, and without thinking, Rafferty moved to her side, wrapping his arms around her. For just a moment, she stiffened, but then she turned into his embrace, crying into his chest as years of grief and pain poured out of her. Margot quietly placed a folder on the table. This is the evidence I promised. Proof that Mr. Blackwood reported your father's crimes before he ever met you. Proof that your relationship had nothing to do with any investigation. The FBI already has copies? but I thought you should see it too." When Sienna finally pulled back from Rafferty, she reached for the folder with shaking hands. She read through the documents, dates, records, witness statements, all of it proving that Rafferty had told her the truth about his investigation being separate from their relationship. "I need you to understand something," Margot said to Sienna. "Your sister's final act was one of incredible love. She was trying to save me, yes, but she was also trying to save you. She didn't want you growing up benefiting from blood money. She wanted you to have a life built on truth. Don't let your father take that away from her. Don't let his lies poison your ability to trust and love. Adelaide would want you to be happy. She would want you to find real love and hold on to it, even when it's scary." Sienna looked at Rafferty, really looked at him, for the first time since that terrible night. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," she said quietly. "What you did hurt me deeply. You took away my choice, and that wasn't fair." "I know," Rafferty said, "and I will spend however long it takes proving to you that I can be the man you deserve. The honest one. The one who trusts you enough to be vulnerable." "But," Sienna continued, and Rafferty's heart nearly stopped, "I also know that my sister died fighting for truth and love, and maybe part of honoring her memory is not letting fear win. Maybe it's choosing to believe that real love is possible, even when it's messy and complicated and starts in the wrong way." "What are you saying?" Rafferty asked, hardly daring to breathe. "I'm saying I need time," Sienna said, "but I'm also saying that when I'm ready I want to try again, the real way this time. With both of us being honest about who we are, no more tests, no more deceptions. Just two broken people trying to figure out if they can heal together." Rafferty felt tears streaming down his face. "I'll wait as long as you need. And when you're ready, I promise I'll be the most honest, most open, most vulnerable version of myself. No more hiding." "Good," Sienna said, and for the first time in days, she almost smiled. "Because I'm going to need someone who understands what it's like to rebuild your life from the ground up. Someone who knows that love isn't about perfection, but about choosing each other even when it's hard." They left the facility as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The drive back was different from the drive there. They talked, really talked, about everything. About Rafferty's past relationship and how it had damaged him. About Sienna's grief for Adelaide and the family she thought she'd known. About their dreams for the future and what rebuilding trust might look like. It wasn't perfect. There were tears and difficult conversations. There were moments when old hurt resurfaced. But there was also hope. Fragile and tentative, but real. 6 months later, Rafferty stood in a courtroom watching Harrison Whitmore be sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Victoria received 15 years as an accessory. Margot Ashford was finally released from the facility, vindicated after 27 years. The families of Harrison's other victims got the closure they'd been seeking, and Sienna stood beside Rafferty, her hand in his, as they testified about Adelaide's heroism and Margot's suffering. They'd been rebuilding their relationship slowly. Coffee dates where they learned about each other all over again, honest conversations about their fears and insecurities, therapy sessions together to work through the trauma and trust issues. Rafferty had shown Sienna his real apartment, his real life, introducing her to the wealth he'd hidden, but making clear that it was just a part of who he was, not his defining feature. Sienna had introduced him to the real her, not the daughter of a wealthy family putting on appearances, but a woman figuring out who she was apart from her family's name. They took it slow. They built their relationship on truth this time, on vulnerability and genuine connection. Some days were harder than others. Some days the weight of everything that had happened threatened to pull them apart. But they kept choosing each other, kept choosing honesty, kept choosing love. 1 year after that terrible Christmas party, Rafferty and Sienna stood at Adelaide's grave, a proper grave now, in a cemetery where people could visit and remember her properly. They laid flowers and told Adelaide about their lives, about how they were honoring her memory by living truthfully. "She'd like you," Sienna said, leaning into Rafferty's side. "Adelaide always said the best relationships were the ones that made you brave enough to be honest, the ones worth fighting for even when it's scary." "Then I'm grateful she raised the bar so high," Rafferty said, kissing the top of Sienna's head. "Because loving you, truly loving you with complete honesty, is the best thing I've ever done." They stood there together as the sun set, two people who'd survived deception and tragedy and found something real on the other side. It wasn't the fairy tale Rafferty had imagined when he'd first created his fake, modest life. It was messier, more complicated, harder won, but it was real. And real, Rafferty had learned, was worth everything. As they walked back to the car, Sienna's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and smiled. A text from Margot, who'd become an unexpected friend to them both. She was thriving in her freedom, writing a book about her experiences and advocating for reform in psychiatric care facilities. "Margot wants to know if we're still coming to her book launch next month," Sienna said. "Wouldn't miss it," Rafferty replied. Then, more quietly, "Do you ever regret it? Giving me another chance?" Sienna stopped walking and turned to face him. "Every day I'm grateful that Adelaide taught me what courage looks like, because it took courage to trust you again. But no, I don't regret it. You've proven every single day since that night that you're committed to being honest with me. You've proven that your love is real, and that's all I ever really wanted. Someone who loves me enough to be truthful even when the truth is uncomfortable." Rafferty pulled her close. "I promise I'll spend the rest of our lives being exactly that person." "Good," Sienna said, reaching up to kiss him. "Because I'm not going anywhere." They drove home together, to the apartment they'd chosen together, furnished with things that reflected both their tastes, built on a foundation of honesty rather than deception. It wasn't perfect. They still had hard days. But they had each other, and they had the truth, and they had the memory of Adelaide reminding them that love worth having was love worth fighting for. And in the end, that was everything.